Racist judge sentences black mother to life in prison, unaware. Her husband is the mayor. The courthouse towered under the gray morning sky, its cold stone pillars casting long shadows of judgment. Angela Reed, a 36-year-old black mother of three, climbed the steps slowly, her back straight but heart heavy. Dressed in her Sunday navy dress, now more armor than clothing, she gripped a worn photo of her children, Jasmine, Tyler, and Caleb. Beside her, Brent Callahan, her anxious court-appointed lawyer, whispered legal terms that did little to ease her fear. Inside, courtroom 2B felt colder than the outside air. The sterile walls and flickering fluorescent lights seemed designed not just to judge, but to break the spirit. Angela sat at the defense table, her fingers clenched tightly in her lap. The prosecution, an overzealous young assistant DA with slicked back hair and an air of practiced arrogance, stood ready with his file of accusations. He barely glanced at her. To him, she was already guilty. "All rise," the bailiff barked. The courtroom stood in perfect unison as Judge Gregory Hartman entered. He was a tall, ghostly figure in a long black robe that trailed behind him like the shadow of something ancient and cruel. His eyes, a pale, steely blue, scanned the room without warmth, without curiosity. Just a flat, merciless gaze that seemed to weigh not guilt, but value. And in his gaze, Angela was worth nothing. "Be seated," he said, and his voice cracked like dry ice. The proceedings began. The prosecutor wasted no time painting Angela as negligent at best, deceptive at worst. He held up the unlabeled pill bottle like it was a loaded weapon. "Found in the glove compartment," he declared. "No label, no prescription, a textbook violation of state narcotics law." Brent Callahan fumbled to his feet. "Your Honor," he began, voice wavering, "Ms. Reed has never had a criminal record. She works 2 jobs, supports her family alone. The pills in question belong to her elderly mother, who suffers from severe hypertension. It was an honest mistake. She was simply transporting them after a shift." Hartman didn't blink. He didn't write anything down. He simply stared. Angela stood, voice firm despite the knot in her throat. "Your Honor, I know I should have kept the label, but those pills, they're the only thing keeping my mom alive. I worked a double shift that night. I was rushing to bring them home, that's all. Please, my children need me. They're all I have, and I'm all they have." The courtroom was silent. Even the gallery, half filled with interns, clerks, and other waiting defendants, felt the weight of her words. Her honesty, her exhaustion, her humanity hung in the air, like a breath waiting to be released. But Judge Hartman remained stone. A long pause. Then he removed his glasses and wiped them with a silk handkerchief, slow and meticulous, like a ritual. When he finally looked back up, his voice was quiet, but sharp enough to slice the air. "This court," he said, "has grown weary of excuses wrapped in emotional appeals." He leaned forward slightly. "You may claim to be a mother, a daughter, even a victim of circumstance. But you are, before this court, a violator of the law. This country is drowning in leniency. If people like you continue to believe that hardship excuses crime, we will cease to be a nation of order." Angela's knees almost buckled. Hartman continued, his tone rising. "Therefore, in accordance with the guidelines of this court, and in consideration of your disregard for proper pharmaceutical procedures, I hereby sentence you to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. The gavel slammed. Gasps broke out across the room. Callahan stood in disbelief. "Your Honor, that's unheard of. The maximum penalty for this offense—" "Sit down, Mr. Callahan," Hartman interrupted, voice suddenly thunderous. "Another word and you will be held in contempt." Angela stood frozen, her breath gone. The world blurred around her. She barely felt the bailiff approaching. She barely registered the click of handcuffs locking around her wrists. Her shoulders slumped under the crushing weight of injustice. She had expected hardship, maybe probation, maybe community service. But this? Life? Tears broke free from her eyes as the reality slammed into her chest like a freight train. Her children, her babies, waiting at home for dinner, waiting for her to come back. What would she tell them? How could she? Her voice cracked in a final desperate whisper. "Please, someone call their school." "Jasmine," She has choir practice today. The courtroom remained silent. The young prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. Even he looked rattled now, the fire drained from his smug expression. The judge stood and exited, robe trailing behind him like a black wave consuming the room. He didn't look back. Angela was led out through a side door, flanked by two officers. Her head hung low. Her tears now flowed freely, unchecked. She didn't resist. She didn't fight. What was the point? From the gallery, a young law student scribbled notes furiously, her hand trembling. She had come to observe judicial proceedings. Instead, she had witnessed a quiet execution. Outside the courthouse, clouds gathered. Inside, justice had just died. And no one, not even the law, lifted a finger to save it. The newsroom alert hit every major channel just after noon. Local mother sentenced to life in controversial drug case. And within minutes, it was everywhere. TVs in diners, offices, waiting rooms, and gas stations flickered with Angela Reed's tear-streaked face as she was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. No context, no explanation. Just a quiet, shattering image of injustice. For most, it was a tragic headline. But for one man, it was a lightning strike to the soul. Inside the sleek office on the top floor of City Hall, Mayor Ethan Reed sat reviewing budget proposals, unaware that his entire life was about to implode. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting warm rays over polished mahogany and pristine white papers. Everything felt calm until the screen behind his desk buzzed to life. Breaking news out of the county courthouse today. Ethan turned absently toward the monitor, coffee mug in hand, his eyes casually glancing at the broadcast. And then he froze. The image on screen wasn't just news, it was personal. Angela, her face pale with disbelief, her wrists shackled, her body trembling as a uniformed officer led her away. For a second, time didn't move. Then the ceramic mug slipped from his hand and shattered against the hardwood floor. The coffee stains spread like blood. Ethan stood up, breath caught in his chest. He stared at the screen, unable to process the image in front of him. Words echoed from the broadcast. Life sentence. Possession of unmarked prescription pills. Judge Hartman's ruling. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, drowning out the rest. The reporter continued. In what many are already calling an excessive sentence, Angela Reed, a mother of three, was given life in prison this morning in what should have been a minor possession charge. Critics are raising questions about Judge Hartman's history of sentencing minority defendants more harshly than white counterparts. Ethan's fists clenched. He hadn't even known Angela had been arrested. She hadn't told him. Of course she hadn't. They had agreed years ago for the safety of their children, their careers, their peace, that their marriage would remain private. No photos, no press releases, not even a joint holiday card. Just stolen weekends at the lake house. Separate addresses during the week. Parallel lives held together by love and secrecy. But now that secrecy had become a cage. He yanked open the drawer in his desk and pulled out a small, worn photo, one no one had ever seen. It showed Angela and their three kids laughing on the beach, their footprints scattered in the sand behind them. She had always hated politics, hated how it swallowed people whole. That's why they kept her life separate, to protect her, to protect them. But this was the opposite of protection. A knock rattled his door. Tom, his chief of staff, poked his head in, face pale. Sir, have you seen? I saw, Ethan cut him off, voice low and seething. Cancel everything. No meetings, no press calls, not a single handshake today. Tom hesitated. Do you want me to find out more about the case? I want Rachel Chen, my lawyer, on the phone, now. His voice cracked like a whip. Tell her it's urgent. As Tom disappeared down the hall, Ethan paced like a caged lion, his hands trembling, his mind racing. How long had she been in jail? Why didn't she call him? Why didn't anyone call him? But he knew the answer. She was trying to protect him, even as the system crushed her. She must have thought it was minor, a misunderstanding, something a public defender could smooth over. He probably never imagined Judge Hartman would bring down the full weight of the law on her shoulders. But Hartman had, And now Angela was behind bars because she dared carry her mother's blood pressure medication in the wrong bottle. And because she was black, the injustice wasn't just legal, it was personal. He stared at the screen again. Her face, still etched with shock and disbelief, flickered before fading into a segment about rising gas prices. As if her life sentence were just another passing story, but not to him, not to their children, and not to the city that would soon learn the truth. Because Ethan Reed had spent his career avoiding scandal, avoiding exposure, but now none of that mattered. Now he was a husband, and his wife had just been buried alive by the justice system. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and snatched the landline from his desk, bypassing every protocol, every layer of staff and assistant. There was no time. He didn't want strategy. He didn't want delay. He wanted action. He dialed a direct number he hadn't used in years. 1 ring, 2. Then a sharp, confident voice answered, "Alvarez." Sophia Alvarez, former federal prosecutor, now one of the most feared legal minds in the state, sharp as a blade, with a reputation for tearing corrupt judges apart in hearings like a surgeon with a scalpel. If anyone could help him take down Judge Hartman, it was her. "Sophia, it's Ethan Reed." There was a pause. "Mayor Reed?" Her voice dropped, cautious. "This must be serious if you're calling me personally." "It's worse than serious," he said, his throat tightening. "It's my wife." Silence. Then, "Go on." "She was just sentenced to life in prison this morning for carrying her mother's medication in an unmarked bottle. No prior record, no intent to distribute. Judge Hartman presided." Sophia's breath caught on the other end. "Hartman? That bastard's still handing out sentences like he's God." "She didn't even tell me she'd been arrested," Ethan continued, pacing the room. "She knew it would hurt my career if it came out. So she went alone, trusted the system. And now, she's in prison, Sophia." "Angela Reed," Sophia said, already typing. "I saw the name on the news. I didn't know." "Ethan, my God." "No one does," he replied, voice low. "No one knows she's my wife." He paused, the weight of that truth choking him. Years of secrecy, years of hiding their marriage for the sake of political safety. All of it now felt like a betrayal, not of the public, but of her. "I need your help," he said. "We need to take Hartman apart, from the inside out, whatever it takes." "You've come to the right place," Sophia said, her tone darkening. "But if we're going to war, I need full access. I need everything. Her case file, Hartman's sentencing records, transcripts, every ounce of dirt. And Ethan, you can't keep your name out of this anymore. If we're going public, you need to stand next to her, not behind." Ethan stopped pacing. He looked at the framed photograph on his desk, one he always kept face down. A candid shot from years ago at the lake house. Angela laughing, barefoot, holding a sparkler in one hand, while Tyler clung to her leg. The kids had been so small then, free, safe. Sophia's voice cut through the silence. "You've spent a decade protecting your image, but protecting your image won't bring your wife home." And she was right. Ethan turned back to the window, staring out over the city he had spent his life serving. It looked the same, but everything had changed. Angela had walked into that courtroom alone because she believed in his mission, because they'd promised each other, "We keep the family private so the cause stays clean." But now the cause was broken, corrupted by a judge who wore his robe like armor and used his gavel like a weapon. Hartman hadn't just attacked Angela, he'd attacked everything Ethan believed in. "I'll go public," Ethan said finally, voice steel. "We've hidden long enough." Sophia didn't hesitate. "Then let's make sure when you step in front of that podium, you do it holding a sword." "I want you digging into Hartman tonight," Ethan ordered. "I want patterns. I want numbers. I want to know every black, brown, or poor defendant he's railroaded in the last 10 years. I want this man's entire career burned to the ground by sunrise." "You'll have it," Sophia promised. "And Ethan, thank you for doing the right thing, even if it costs you everything." He hung up the phone slowly, the adrenaline in his blood now hardening into resolve. Then he turned to his chief of staff, who had re-entered the room, nervously clutching a tablet. "Tom, draft a press statement. No spin, no politics, just the truth. I want the people to hear it straight from me. Angela Reed is my wife. She has been wrongfully convicted, and I won't rest until justice is done. The conference room on the 12th floor of City Hall had never felt so alive or so dangerous. It was after midnight, but the air buzzed with adrenaline. The lights were harsh, fluorescent, sterile. On the massive oak table, laptops flickered, manila folders piled high, and a sea of printed court records spilled like damning confessions across the polished surface. Mayor Ethan Reed stood at one end of the table, sleeves rolled up, tie discarded, hands planted on the edge as he stared down at the growing mountain of evidence. Across from him sat Sofia Alvarez, the city's most formidable legal strategist. Her eyes moved fast, scanning pages, highlighting key names, circling patterns with surgical precision. Neither of them had eaten. Neither of them cared. They weren't here to rest. They were here to bring a system to its knees. I've run the numbers 3 times, Sophia said, her voice low, clipped, focused. She pushed a thick folder across the table. 5 years, 214 felony cases presided over by Judge Gregory Hartman. Ethan opened the file. Charts, names, sentences, demographics. 80% of harsh sentences, she continued, went to black and brown defendants. For identical or lesser charges than white defendants received probation or fines. That's not just disparity, Ethan. That's institutional violence in a robe. Ethan's jaw tensed. And no one said anything? People tried, Sophia said, flipping to a handwritten complaint buried in an old file. But every time someone pushed back, it vanished, buried under judicial discretion. She pulled out another sheet, a sealed disciplinary report, never followed up. A defense attorney once filed a formal objection after Hartman mocked her Hispanic client's accent in open court. The complaint? Closed. No action taken. The further they dug, the darker it became. One after another, the files exposed a pattern of blatant racial bias. Longer sentences for people of color, condescending comments in transcripts, evidence of Hartman overriding jury recommendations. And then they found the letter. Sophia held it up, eyes narrowing. This is where the real storm begins. It was an old scanned document, dated nearly 30 years ago, buried in a dusty law journal archive. A signed opinion piece by Gregory Hartman, then a young legal associate. The headline read, "Preserving the Integrity of Traditional Education, a Case Against Forced Integration." Ethan took the paper, eyes narrowing as he read the words. Hartman had argued eloquently, but unmistakably, that homogeneous learning environments allow for stronger cultural unity, and that preserving traditional white academic institutions ensures educational excellence. It was cloaked in academic language, but the message was clear. Segregation by another name. Sophia dropped a second file onto the table. Guess who sponsored the article? Ethan opened it and froze. The American Heritage Order, a defunct organization once listed by civil rights groups as a white nationalist legal think tank. Jesus Christ, he muttered. It gets worse. Sophia clicked on her laptop, pulling up a digitized yearbook from 1991. She zoomed in on a black and white photo. Hartman, mid-20s, wearing a blazer, standing next to a sign that read, "Tradition over Tolerance," smiling proudly. He had been a board member of a fraternity known for racially charged initiations. How has this man been a judge for 15 years? Ethan whispered. Because no one ever shined a light this bright, Sophia said. Until now. A tense silence hung between them. The weight of what they'd uncovered felt like dynamite, volatile, undeniable, and powerful enough to blow the doors off the courthouse. Then Ethan spoke, his voice low and steady. We take this public. We burn down the walls protecting this man. Sophia met his eyes. This isn't just about Angela anymore. I know, he said. It's about every mother, every father, every kid who sat in that courtroom thinking the system would treat them fairly, only to watch their future vanish with a bang of his gavel. Sophia nodded once, then reached for her phone. I'll send everything to Rachel Chen. She needs to prep her team for a full-scale judicial misconduct case. As she typed, Ethan walked to the massive window overlooking the city. The streets below were quiet, but his city was on the edge of something massive. And when the truth came out, it would erupt. And that eruption began before dawn. The next morning, a leak hit social media. A screenshot of Hartman's old article with his name circled in red, then the yearbook photo, then sentencing charts. Someone, no one knew who, had taken the files and dropped them into the public domain. It spread like wildfire. By 9 a.m., Expose Hartman and Justice for Angela were trending nationally. By 10:30 a.m., the Chronicle Tribune ran a full feature. The Judge Behind the Robe, a deep dive into Hartman's disturbing past. Inside the article were images from court records, anonymous testimonies from defense attorneys, and quotes from civil rights advocates demanding Hartman's removal. Protests sparked outside the courthouse. Peaceful but furious. Signs held high. "We trusted you. You betrayed us. Angela is all of us. Bias is not justice." Outside City Hall, a woman in scrubs stood with her 2 children, holding a sign that read, "That could have been my mother." Meanwhile, reporters swarmed Hartman's chambers, demanding a response. The judge refused to appear. His office remained silent, but silence only fueled the fire. That afternoon, Ethan held an emergency meeting with his senior staff in the district attorney's office. Inside the room, documents were pinned to every wall. Hartman's connections, photos, legal opinions. Rachel Chen stood near the center, arms crossed, scanning the evidence. "This isn't just enough to open a misconduct investigation," she said. "It's enough to put him on trial." Ethan didn't blink. "Then let's do it." That night, he drafted the statement he never thought he'd have to write. In it, he named names. He cited statistics. He confirmed Angela was his wife, and that her case was the spark that exposed a rotting branch of the city's justice system. He ended it with one line: "Justice cannot exist where bias is allowed to thrive." It ends now. By sunrise, every major outlet in the country had picked up the story. The dam had broken, and behind it, a tidal wave of long-buried truth was crashing forward, ready to drown the old system in light. Angela Reed had never known silence like this. It wasn't the kind that brought peace. It was the kind that scraped against your soul like broken glass. The kind that echoed off concrete walls and metal bars, hollow and relentless, like a cruel lullaby sung by the system meant to break you. Her cell was small, barely wide enough to stretch her arms. The mattress was thin and lumpy, pressing her bones into the cold steel frame every night. Her pillow was no thicker than a folded towel. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed constantly, flickering every few seconds like they, too, were on the verge of giving up. She hadn't seen the sky in 4 days. Angela sat hunched on the edge of her cot, elbows on her knees, fingers tangled in her hair. Her navy blue dress, the one she had worn with pride to court, was now stained, wrinkled, and damp with the sweat of fear. It still carried the scent of her youngest son's hug that morning before she was taken. Baby powder, peanut butter, and the warm scent of home. That was a lifetime ago now. Each hour dragged like molasses. Meals were served with mechanical indifference. Guards spoke in clipped commands. The other inmates kept to themselves, not out of cruelty, but out of survival. No one wanted to attach themselves to someone who looked as broken as Angela did. She hadn't cried since the sentence. The tears had come in the courtroom, quietly, helplessly. Now she was past tears. What lived inside her now was colder, heavier, despair, the kind that sunk into her bones and made her question if she'd ever feel sunlight again. Then on the 5th morning, just after roll call, when she sat in the corner of the recreation room staring blankly at a crack in the floor, one of the guards approached with a yellow envelope. "Mail," he grunted, tossing it onto her lap. Angela blinked. Mail? She hadn't expected any. No one even knew she was here. She turned the envelope over and gasped. It was covered in stickers, rainbows, hearts. One smudged corner had a tiny paw print drawn in pencil. And in the middle, scrawled in uneven handwriting with purple marker, were the words, "To Mommy," from Jasmine, Tyler, and Caleb. Her breath caught. Hands shaking, she tore the envelope open and pulled out a folded piece of notebook paper. The first page was covered in crayon drawings, stick figures of the kids holding hands with her, standing in front of their tiny house. A big sun smiled down at them, and the words, "We love you," floated in clouds above their heads. Angela's vision blurred. She turned the page and found a letter, clearly written by her eldest Jasmine, just 13 but suddenly forced to carry the weight of a world far too cruel for someone her age. Dear Mommy, we miss you. We don't know why they won't let you come home. I told Caleb and Tyler it was just a misunderstanding, like when the neighbor's dog got loose and everyone was mad. But then they forgave him. Caleb asked if you did something bad and I said no. You just love people too much. Tyler cried when he saw your picture on the TV. He tried to hug the screen. He doesn't understand. I said you were helping people even in jail. That's what heroes do. Grandma is trying her best, but she's tired. Her back hurts when she picks Caleb up. Grandpa sometimes forgets to give Tyler his allergy meds. I help with homework and cook dinner when I can, but the stove is scary. I miss your singing at bedtime. I miss your pancakes. I miss your laugh. Please come home soon, Mommy. We need you. I need you. Love always, your Jasmine. Angela didn't realize she was sobbing until her hands began to shake violently, the paper crumpling between her fingers. She curled around the letter, folding into herself as if trying to protect the words from the harshness of the world around her. This was the soundless scream of a mother robbed of her children. Every second she remained here, her daughter was being forced to grow up too fast. Her sons were sleeping without kisses goodnight. Her parents, elderly, struggling, were trying to hold together a life they had no strength left to carry. And she had been thrown in this cage for a bottle of heart medication, her mother's pills, unlabeled, found in her glove box after a routine traffic stop. No prior record, no history of drug abuse, no malice. Only a black woman, alone, standing in front of a white-robed judge with no mercy in his eyes. And that had been enough. Angela's despair began to shift, slowly, painfully, into something else. Fire. It started as a flicker, a tiny ember in the pit of her chest. It didn't burn yet, but it glowed, warm, alive. It reminded her of the light in Jasmine's eyes when she sang in the church choir, of Tyler's uncontrollable laughter during movie nights, of Caleb's tiny hand gripping hers at the grocery store. They hadn't taken her love. They hadn't taken her memory. They hadn't taken her will. She unfolded the letter again and stared at Jasmine's final words. I need you. Angela sat up straighter. Her back hurt. Her arms ached. But she felt taller. She pressed the letter to her heart, then stood and walked back to her cell. As she sat on the cot, she stared at the cracked ceiling above her. She didn't know how long it would take. She didn't know who would help. But she made herself a promise, right there in the silence. She would survive. She would outlast this place. And when the world finally opened its eyes to the injustice that brought her here, she would be ready. That night, while the rest of the prison slept, Angela wrote back. She borrowed a pen from a quiet cellmate and asked the guard for extra paper. In crooked handwriting, she poured everything she had into that letter. She told Jasmine how proud she was, how strong she was, how beautiful her voice was when she sang, how much she believed that no matter how dark it seemed now, they would be together again. She ended with a promise. I will come home. You hear me, baby? I will. And when I do, I'm never letting go again. In a house miles away, Jasmine tucked her brothers into bed and stared at the empty chair across the dinner table. She didn't know when Mommy would write back. She didn't know if Mommy could, but she believed, because sometimes belief is all a child has, and in a cell filled with shadows, that belief was enough to keep a mother breathing, fighting, surviving, waiting for justice. The fight for justice is just beginning. More shocking twists are ahead. Don't miss a moment. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay with us. Thank you for standing for truth and justice. Where are you watching from? Let us know. The press conference was scheduled for 5 p.m., but by 4:15, the City Hall courtyard was already a hive of tension. Reporters from every major news network clustered behind velvet ropes, cameras primed, microphones angled toward the empty podium like soldiers at attention. The air was heavy with humidity and rumor. No one knew exactly what was coming, but they all sensed something seismic. Word had leaked earlier that afternoon. Mayor Ethan Reed had canceled every meeting, shut down his schedule, and summoned the press with a single, cryptic message. I have something urgent to say. You'll want to be here. Whispers turned to wildfire. Speculation surged online. Some said it was about the controversial life sentence handed down days earlier to a black mother named Angela Reed. Some suggested Ethan was stepping down. Others wondered if the two stories were connected. No one was ready for what was about to happen. At exactly 5 p.m., Ethan stepped up to the podium. No suit jacket, no American flag pin, no pre-written statement. Just a man, sleeves rolled, eyes tired, jaw clenched like a soldier walking into battle. The first flashbulb exploded, then another, then dozens. He didn't blink. He leaned into the microphone, voice calm but charged with purpose. Good evening. I stand before you today not just as your mayor, but as a husband, and a father, and a man who can no longer remain silent. A ripple of confusion swept through the crowd. The woman sentenced to life in prison this week for a nonviolent possession charge is my wife. Angela Reed is my wife. Gasps, audible and sharp. Reporters jolted forward, cameras surged. Social media exploded within seconds. The live stream from City Hall was already trending worldwide. For over a decade, we've kept our marriage private, not because we were ashamed, but because we wanted to protect our family from the spotlight. But now that silence is hurting the person I love most. Ethan's voice cracked, just slightly, but he held steady. Angela was arrested while carrying her elderly mother's heart medication in a bottle without a label. She has no record. She works 2 jobs. She raised 3 children. She volunteers. She cares. And Judge Gregory Hartman gave her life in prison. A stunned silence blanketed the courtyard. Not because of the crime, but because of who she is, because of the color of her skin, because this justice system is not broken. It is operating exactly the way it was designed to, and that design has always been stacked against people like my wife. The words hit like thunder. Reporters began yelling questions, but Ethan raised a hand, silencing the storm. I'm not here to protect a political image. I'm here to expose a lie that's been poisoning our city for far too long. I've reviewed Hartman's record. The numbers speak for themselves. 80% of his harshest sentences have gone to black and brown defendants. His history with white nationalist organizations is not speculation. It's documented. And now the woman I love is paying the price. Ethan paused, pulled a folded photo from his pocket and held it up for the cameras. This is my family. Angela, Jasmine, Tyler, Caleb. That is who Judge Hartman sentenced. Not a criminal, but a mother, a wife, a citizen. And I will fight for her with everything I have. He stepped back, and the press room erupted. Microphones were thrust forward. Dozens of questions shouted at once. When did you marry? Why keep it secret? What legal action are you taking? Is Judge Hartman being investigated? Is this the end of your political career? Ethan answered only one question before leaving the podium. My career is irrelevant. My wife's freedom is not. And neither is justice. He turned, walked off stage, and left a firestorm in his wake. Within 30 minutes, the city was on fire, not with flames, but with fury. News anchors scrambled to adjust coverage. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram exploded with hashtags, Justice for Angela, Fire Hartman. Mayor Reed Cable news hosts who had dismissed Angela's case earlier in the week now replayed the footage of her in shackles with a new lens, a lens of outrage, empathy, and shame. Civil rights organizations issued immediate statements. Protests that had begun small swelled into full-scale marches. By nightfall, the courthouse steps were flooded with people. Mothers, fathers, college students, nurses, ministers, construction workers. Some carried candles, others carried signs. Angela is all of us. Justice shouldn't depend on skin color. Hartman must go. Helicopters hovered above. Police formed barricades, but there was no violence, only volume. Anguish turned into action. Downtown intersections were shut down by human chains. A group of local pastors locked arms and prayed loudly in front of the courthouse entrance, demanding accountability. In one of the city's poorest neighborhoods, a mural of Angela was spray-painted overnight on a brick wall. The image showed her not in handcuffs, but with her arms outstretched, protecting her children beneath her. Below it, in blood-red paint, "She should be home." The next morning, the protest didn't stop. It multiplied. By 8 a.m., there were demonstrations in 6 parts of the city. High school students walked out of classrooms. Bus drivers refused routes to the courthouse. Hospital staff gathered outside their own buildings in silent solidarity. City Hall's phone lines crashed from the sheer volume of calls. Then came the clergy. Leaders from over 20 churches, synagogues, and mosques convened a press conference of their own, standing united on the courthouse steps. "We don't stand here as politicians," said Reverend Alicia Monroe, eyes blazing. "We stand here as moral witnesses, and we say no more. No more lives stolen by a system that disguises punishment as justice." Inside his home, Judge Hartman watched from his television. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted his coffee mug, but this time he spilled it. Reporters camped outside his gated estate, shouting questions he refused to answer. His official statement, released through a court spokesperson, was brief and cold. "The judge stands by his legal ruling and has no further comment at this time." But the city wasn't waiting for comment. It was demanding change. By the afternoon, national figures had joined the outcry. Congresswomen, civil rights lawyers, activists with millions of followers. Then came the video. A newly surfaced clip from 3 years ago showed Hartman chuckling in his chambers, muttering about how these inner-city cases are all the same. It ignited the crowd like gasoline on flame. The State Judicial Review Board announced it would open a formal investigation into Judge Hartman's conduct. Anonymous tips flooded their inbox. Former clerks, public defenders, even courtroom janitors who remembered jokes and comments that now, in the light of day, reeked of systemic rot. Inside the prison, Angela sat on her cot, unaware of the storm raging outside, until the guard brought a TV into the common room. And there he was, Ethan, standing behind that podium, telling the world the truth. Her eyes widened, her mouth trembled. Then came the footage of the protests, the murals, the signs, the women holding candles, the children marching with megaphones. And she broke. Her hands flew to her mouth. Tears streamed down her face, unstoppable, raw. Not from pain this time, but from hope. She was not alone. They were fighting for her, and maybe, just maybe, the world was finally listening. Angela Reed had been thrown in a cell for carrying her mother's medication. But when her husband stepped forward, when the people rose around her story became more than tragedy. It became a rallying cry, and the city would never be the same again. The courthouse clock had just struck 9 a.m. when Sofia Alvarez stormed through the double doors of the state appeals office, her heels clapping against the marble floor like gunshots in a silent war. Her leather briefcase was packed to bursting, and her expression was carved from stone. She didn't pause to greet anyone. She didn't need to. Everyone already knew who she was and what she was about to do. She marched straight to the front desk and slammed down a stack of manila folders, bound tight with red string. "I'm filing an emergency appeal," she said, her voice calm but thunderous, "on behalf of Angela Reed and 43 others who have been victims of systematic, racially motivated sentencing by Judge Gregory Hartman." Clerk blinked, stunned. 43? Sophia nodded. And counting. The room seemed to freeze. Within the hour, her motion hit the judicial network like a lightning strike. The petition wasn't just about Angela. It was a sweeping appeal attached to a dossier of damning evidence. Transcripts, sentencing records, statistical comparisons, and sworn affidavits. The 43 cases she submitted showed a clear, irrefutable pattern. Black and brown defendants sentenced up to 5 times longer than white defendants for the same offenses, many of them minor, nonviolent, or first-time charges. The media picked it up before lunch. The front page of every major outlet featured Sophia's motion in bold. Civil rights attorney files emergency appeal against Judge Hartman, cites racial bias in over 40 cases. Sophia didn't stop there. By afternoon, she had scheduled a live briefing on the courthouse steps. Cameras rolled as she stood firm behind a podium, hair pulled back, eyes blazing with righteous fire. This isn't just about one woman. This is about a system that allowed one man in a robe to quietly destroy lives for over a decade, without oversight, without consequence, and without anyone brave enough to stop him. That ends today. Behind her stood representatives from community organizations, churches, civil rights groups, and citizens who had stayed quiet for far too long. One of them was Marlon Davis, a former defendant who had once stood trembling in Hartman's courtroom for a marijuana possession charge. The white defendant before him walked free with a warning. Marlon was given 4 years. He stepped forward now, gripping the microphone with both hands. I lost everything because of that man. My job, my apartment, my daughter's trust. Now I finally know I wasn't alone. That night, the city boiled over. Neighborhood after neighborhood lit up with protests, not with rage, but with purpose. Thousands marched under banners that read, "Justice for the 43. Bias is a crime. Reform starts now." What had begun as scattered outrage had crystallized into a movement. Law students set up legal aid tents. Clergy members held all-night vigils. Barbershops, libraries, and community centers became hubs of strategy and solidarity. Angela's story had become the spark. Sophia's appeal was the fire. The pressure on the judicial system was unrelenting. Phone lines at the appeals court were jammed for 3 days straight. Email inboxes overflowed with statements from advocacy groups, former defendants, even jurors who had felt uneasy about Hartman's behavior, but never knew how deep it ran. At one point, a group of retired judges signed a public letter supporting Sophia's appeal, stating, "No individual should hold the gavel that weighs heavier on one skin color than another." City officials tried to stay neutral, but neutrality was no longer an option. You were either part of the silence or part of the resistance. Inside prison walls, the ripple effect reached Angela. The guards were no longer indifferent. They were watchful, cautious. Inmates whispered her name with reverence. Some passed her notes. Others offered quiet nods of solidarity. One morning, a cafeteria worker slipped her a folded napkin. Inside was a single line. "They're fighting for you. Don't stop fighting back." Angela tucked the note inside Jasmine's letter. Her fire was burning hotter than ever now. Meanwhile, Sophia worked around the clock. With her legal team camped inside a temporary office lined with case files and news clippings, she prepared for the appeals hearing like it was a war council. Dozens of volunteers sorted testimonies. Interns cross-checked sentencing records. Former Hartman defendants poured in by the hour, desperate to be heard. Each new name strengthened the case. Each story added another stone to the mountain of injustice. And at the center of it all, Angela's name remained the banner they marched under. The day before the hearing, the courthouse steps became a stage. A massive demonstration formed, stretching across 4 city blocks. Families, lawyers, teenagers, veterans, nurses, and teachers all came together, not with anger, but with a demand. A choir sang "A Change is Gonna Come." Children held signs that read, "My future shouldn't depend on the color of my skin. Judge fair or don't judge at all." And just before dusk, Sophia took the stage again. No script, no teleprompter, just truth. The law is supposed to be blind, but for too long it's been squinting at color. Tomorrow we give it back its vision. We demand better, not just for Angela, not just for the 43, but for every person who's ever walked into a courtroom and felt invisible. The crowd roared. Candles were lit, prayers were whispered, and somewhere in a tiny cell, Angela sat with her head held high, the photo of her children in one hand, and the letter from Jasmine in the other. The weight of injustice hadn't crushed her. It had forged her into something stronger. Tomorrow her name would echo in the halls of power. Tomorrow the system would be forced to look itself in the mirror. And for the first time in a long, long time, it wouldn't like what it saw. The morning of the appeals hearing arrived like a thunderclap. By 7 a.m., the line outside the courthouse stretched for nearly 3 blocks. People came dressed in black, not for mourning, but for solidarity. They held signs close to their chests. Justice for Angela, equality isn't optional, one voice, one fight. Local news stations parked satellite trucks along the sidewalks, anchoring live broadcasts as cameras rolled and whispers spread. By 8 a.m., courtroom 4A, usually half empty on any given Tuesday, was overflowing. Every bench was packed shoulder to shoulder. Reporters sat cross-legged on the floor. Law students stood along the walls scribbling into notepads with trembling hands. Even the overflow room, equipped with a live video feed, was at capacity. But it wasn't the crowd that made the air feel suffocating. It was the weight of anticipation, the sense that everything was about to shift, the moment when the law would either redeem itself or damn itself completely. At 8:30 sharp, the panel of 3 appellate judges filed into the room. Their black robes flowed like waves in a rising tide. In the center sat Judge Eleanor Whitmore, a woman known for her sharp intellect and unshakable poise. Her gray eyes scanned the courtroom like searchlights. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. And with that, Sofia Alvarez rose to her feet. She stood tall behind the defense table, no notes in front of her, just a single binder and a mind sharpened like steel. She looked like a general in the middle of battle, and she was ready for war. "May it please the court," she began, voice steady, clear, and bold. "We are not here to ask for favors. We are here to demand justice that should have been delivered months ago. My client, Angela Reed, was sentenced to life in prison for a nonviolent possession charge. Her first offense, because she carried her mother's prescribed medication in an unmarked bottle. That should have been a ticket, at most a warning. Instead, it became a life sentence." She paused, letting the words settle like dust in the silence. "Your Honors," she continued, "this is not an isolated error. This is the product of a pattern, a long-standing, documented practice of racially biased sentencing by Judge Gregory Hartman. Today I will present to you video evidence, statistical breakdowns, sworn affidavits, and eyewitness testimony that will make that truth impossible to ignore." She gestured toward the screen set up beside the bench. The lights dimmed. First video played. Angela's sentencing. The footage showed her standing before Judge Hartman, pleading with dignity and composure. It showed her lawyer objecting to the excessive punishment. It showed Hartman's cold, detached delivery of the sentence. Life in prison, with no remorse, no hesitation, no mercy. The silence in the courtroom was broken only by the soft, muffled gasps from the gallery. Sofia pressed a button. A second video loaded, this time showing a white defendant who, only weeks earlier, had been caught with multiple prescription bottles under a false name. Judge Hartman gave him probation and community service. The difference was damning. She moved swiftly, page after page, chart after chart. Sofia presented a 5-year analysis. 82% of Hartman's harshest sentences had gone to minority defendants. On-screen graphs rose like dark mountains of proof. Then came the testimonies. A former court clerk who described Hartman's private jokes about those kinds of people always lying. A public defender who detailed how Hartman routinely interrupted black defendants, cutting their testimony short. A juror who recalled Hartman's face souring whenever a defendant's skin wasn't white. And then, Sofia called her final witness. "Your Honors," she said, her voice softening, "I would now like to call to the stand Mrs. Lorraine Jackson, Angela Reed's mother." A hush fell over the room. From the gallery, an elderly woman rose slowly. Her gray curls framed a tired face. Her hands shook slightly as she took the oath and approached the witness stand. Sofia guided her gently. "Mrs. Jackson," she said, "can you please tell the court about the medication in question?" Lorraine cleared her throat, her voice fragile but steady. "I suffer from chronic heart failure," she began. "That medicine, it keeps me alive. Angela was just bringing it home to me. I had put it in an unmarked bottle because my old hands couldn't open the childproof caps anymore. She offered to drive it over after her night shift." She paused, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "She wasn't selling it. She wasn't hiding it. She was helping me, helping her children. That's all she ever does. My Angela's the strongest woman I know. And now she's locked away like some kind of monster." Gasps rippled through the room. A few people wiped tears from their eyes. Even Judge Whitmore leaned forward, her fingers steepled in front of her mouth. "Thank you, Mrs. Jackson," Sofia said gently. "No further questions." As Lorraine stepped down, she passed by the defense table and touched Sophia's hand with trembling fingers. "You bring my baby home," she whispered. Sophia nodded once. "I will." Outside the courthouse, a crowd of hundreds had gathered, following every word via live stream on a massive screen. They cheered, they cried, they fell into silence at every revelation. Church bells rang at noon in solidarity. In classrooms, students watched from laptops. In barbershops, people stopped mid-cut. It was more than a trial now. It was a reckoning. Back in the courtroom, Sophia delivered her closing argument. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Angela Reed is not a number. She is not a case file. She is a mother, a daughter, a citizen. She is the embodiment of everything this system is supposed to protect. Instead, it punished her for being black, for being poor, for trusting a system that failed her. She turned, locking eyes with the panel. "Your Honors, this appeal is not only a chance to right one wrong, it is a chance to begin healing a system that has bled our communities dry for far too long. Don't let this courtroom become another monument to injustice. Let it be the moment when justice remembered its purpose." She stepped back. The courtroom held its breath. Judge Whitmore nodded slowly. "The court will recess to deliberate. A ruling will be delivered shortly." The gavel struck once, and the room exhaled. People spilled into the hallways, buzzing, tense, emotional. Angela's family huddled together. Her mother clutched Jasmine's hand. Tyler sat on the bench, biting his lip, his legs swinging. Sophia stepped outside, leaned against the wall, and closed her eyes. She had delivered everything she had. Now it was up to the court. Inside the deliberation room, the three judges pored over the evidence. Judge Whitmore tapped her pen once, then twice. Her voice, low and clear, broke the silence. "We don't just have evidence of bias. We have a blueprint of systemic failure. And it ends today." Back in courtroom 4A, the people returned to their seats. The courtroom was silent. So silent, in fact, that you could hear the sound of a single camera shutter click in the back row. Every eye was fixed on the bench. Every breath was held like it might shatter the moment. The weight of weeks of injustice, protest, investigation, truth-telling, and relentless hope had all come to this. And now, as Judge Eleanor Whitmore lifted the verdict sheet in her hands, the air became electric. Angela Reed stood in her prison-issued clothing, shoulders squared, eyes unwavering. She had spent the last 4 weeks shackled behind walls that sought to erase her. But she stood here now, in open court, flanked by her attorney, Sophia Alvarez, waiting to hear if the system that had failed her once would have the courage to make it right. Judge Whitmore's voice rang out with firm finality. "After thorough review of the original sentencing, presented evidence, and new testimony, this court finds the ruling in the case of the state versus Angela Reed to be not only unjust, but unconstitutional." A stunned hush. "We hereby vacate the sentence in full. Angela Reed is free to go, effective immediately." And just like that, the dam broke. Sophia dropped her pen, overcome. Angela gasped, staggering back slightly as tears welled in her eyes, too stunned to speak. Her hands flew to her mouth, trembling. The judge continued, her voice unwavering. "Furthermore, the court recommends an emergency review of all cases presided over by Judge Gregory Hartman. Effective today, he is suspended from the bench pending formal investigation for judicial misconduct, racial bias, and abuse of power." The gallery erupted. Gasps, cheers, applause that thundered through the walls. And Angela, she stood frozen, overwhelmed, until she felt the warm, familiar hands of her daughter Jasmine, suddenly running down the aisle, sobbing and shouting, "Mom!" Tyler was right behind her, arms outstretched. Caleb trailed with a tiny scream of joy as their grandmother stumbled to her feet in tears. Angela dropped to her knees, catching all 3 of her babies in her arms as they barreled into her. Jasmine cried into her chest. Tyler held her hand like a lifeline. Caleb refused to let go of her neck. It was no longer a courtroom. It was a miracle. Camera flashes burst like fireworks as the family clung to one another. Angela kissed each of their foreheads, eyes closed, whispering over and over again, "I'm here. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Outside the courthouse, the crowd that had gathered for hours under the sun holding signs, chanting songs, praying in circles, was watching the live stream on the massive digital screen set up on the lawn. And the moment Judge Whitmore said those words, "Angela Reed is free to go," the lawn exploded. People screamed. Strangers hugged. Some dropped to their knees, sobbing in joy. Others threw their fists in the air. Dozens of churchgoers fell into spontaneous gospel hymns. A line of children holding handmade signs that said, "Free Angela," jumped up and down chanting, "She's free! She's free! She's free!" The reporters on site struggled to keep up. One anchor dropped her notes entirely and turned to the camera. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have just witnessed one of the most historic reversals of injustice in this state's history." The courthouse doors finally opened and Angela stepped into the sunlight. The crowd roared. She was no longer in orange. Someone had handed her a simple white blouse and jeans. Her hair was loose. Her face was glowing with tears and disbelief and strength. Her family followed, Jasmine still holding her hand, Caleb on her hip, Tyler walking proudly beside her. Behind them, Sofia Alvarez emerged to thunderous applause, holding up the folder of court documents like a trophy. The cameras swarmed them. Angela was asked question after question, microphones shoved into her path. But she stopped, took a breath, and turned toward the crowd. "I went into that prison thinking the world had forgotten me," she said, her voice hoarse but powerful. "But you didn't forget. You fought. You marched. You spoke my name when I couldn't speak for myself." She looked at her children. "They tried to take me away from my babies. They tried to break me. But I'm still here, and I'm not just walking out for me. I'm walking out for every woman, every mother, every soul who's been thrown away by a system that refuses to see us." Tears streamed down faces in the crowd. She stepped down the courthouse steps, sunlight bathing her face, and as she walked through the crowd, people reached out to touch her shoulder, to hold her hand, to say thank you. Jasmine kept glancing up at her mother like she couldn't believe she was real, and the city, so long divided, felt whole for a moment. Inside the courthouse, in a chamber stripped of its usual calm, Judge Gregory Hartman sat alone at his desk, watching the news feed. His hands were trembling. The suspension notice had arrived just minutes after the ruling. The Judicial Conduct Board had delivered it personally. His name was on every news ticker in the nation. His past affiliations, his sentencing disparities, his remarks. All of it had come into the light, and the robe he once wore with arrogance and impunity now sat folded on the edge of his desk. No longer a symbol of power, but of disgrace. Outside, the people chanted one word: justice, justice, justice. That evening, the city held its breath as the sun dipped below the horizon. But instead of descending into silence, it exploded into celebration. Angela's old neighborhood held a block party in her honor. Local musicians played. Barbers offered free cuts. Kids painted murals on brick walls, Angela with her fist raised, surrounded by light. In front of City Hall, Mayor Ethan Reed gave a televised statement. "Today, my wife came home, but more importantly, justice came home. Let this be the beginning, not the end of reform." He stepped aside, letting Angela speak. She didn't speak long. She didn't have to. "I was just one, but we are many. Let's keep fighting." Later that night, back in the house that had waited patiently for her return, Angela tucked Caleb into bed. Tyler had fallen asleep with his head on her lap during movie night. Jasmine sat on the couch, curled up against her side. The news still played in the background, but Angela wasn't watching anymore. She was looking at her children, holding them, breathing them in, alive, home, free. Upstairs, a letter sat on her nightstand, the same one Jasmine had sent her in prison. "We miss you, Mommy. Please come home soon." Angela placed her hand on it, whispering, "I kept my promise, baby. I came home." And somewhere in the distance, the sound of a city finally waking up to its own conscience echoed through the streets. Justice had not just been served, it had been reclaimed. And it all began with one woman who refused to be silenced, one family who refused to give up, and a city that at last chose truth over tradition. Angela Reed was free, but her fight lit a fire that would never be put out. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. The banner behind the podium read in bold white letters, "Justice for all. A new dawn begins." Angela Reed stood at the center of the open-air stage in front of City Hall, the morning sun casting a golden glow across her face. Her poise was unmistakable, her presence magnetic. The woman who had once stood in chains, sentenced to life for a crime she didn't commit, now stood tall before a sea of supporters, not as a victim, but as a leader of change. To her left stood Mayor Ethan Reed, no longer hiding their marriage, but holding her hand proudly as the crowd of hundreds cheered them on. Behind them, a newly unveiled banner stretched across the building, Justice for All Initiative, founded by Angela and Ethan Reed. It had only been 4 months since Angela had walked free, but what followed was a whirlwind of transformation. Rather than retreat quietly into the background, Angela stepped forward with purpose. She and Ethan had poured every resource, every connection, and every ounce of pain and resilience into the creation of the Justice for All Initiative, a movement that would not just fight wrongful convictions, but challenge the deep systemic roots that allowed injustice to thrive. They started with one goal: review every case sentenced under Judge Hartman's gavel. With the cooperation of the District Attorney's Office and a growing team of attorneys, activists, and data scientists, they launched a citywide audit. And the results were staggering. 43 cases were immediately flagged. Within weeks, the number had grown to 78. Each file revealed another person, many of them poor, many of them people of color, who had been handed disproportionately harsh sentences. Now, months later, dozens of these individuals were walking free, families reunited, tears shed in courtrooms that had once been grounds of despair now became sanctuaries of redemption. Angela stood before the crowd, microphone in hand, her voice firm yet intimate, like she was speaking to each heart in the audience individually. "I was one woman, one case, one mother," she began, "and I could have come out of that cell and just gone home. I could have chosen peace over battle. But how could I rest knowing that the cell I left behind would simply be filled with the next person the system failed?" The crowd murmured in agreement, many wiping away tears. "Justice is not just about overturning one verdict," she continued, her voice rising. "It's about overturning a system that allows injustice to hide in plain sight. It's about breaking a cycle so deep that we no longer even question its cruelty." She looked out over the crowd, families holding signs, lawyers standing shoulder to shoulder with former inmates, students recording every word, hoping this speech would be the beginning of their own fight for change. Justice isn't about winning a case. It's about repairing what was broken. And it's going to take every single one of us, not just lawyers and judges, but parents and teachers, journalists and neighbors. This isn't my fight anymore. It's our mission. Thunderous applause erupted. The press cameras zoomed in as Angela held up a small photograph, one of her in prison, holding Jasmine's handwritten letter against her chest. "This was my strength," she said softly, "and now it will be the strength for every man and woman still waiting for the system to see them." Ethan stepped beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "From this day forward," he added, "we don't hide, we don't compromise, and we don't stop until every voice is heard and every injustice is brought into the light." The Justice for All initiative grew fast. Cities sought help, law schools joined, and prosecutors reopened old cases. Angela became a national voice, not of pain, but of purpose. Sophia led a team exposing biased judges. Reform spread. But Angela knew true justice began at home. That night, the Reed family shared dinner. Laughter, love, no more hiding. Angela looked at them and said, "We're not hiding anymore. We're not running. We lead now." Once silenced, she now led a movement, turning injustice into lasting change. Court calls Black woman a fraud. Unaware. She holds the highest clearance in the CIA. The court accused a Black woman of fraud, only to discover she was one of the CIA's most powerful agents. "Dr. Carter, did you really falsify your identity?" Is it true that you never worked for the government? Could this be the scam of the century? Why have all records of you disappeared? The questions came like sharp knives, cutting through the heavy air. Every word rang with malice, digging into the growing suspicions that surrounded the woman at the center of America's attention. In front of the Washington, D.C. federal courthouse, a sea of people churned with restless energy. Hundreds of reporters, journalists, and onlookers crowded together, desperate to witness the moment Naomi Carter would fall. A black woman, someone like her, in their eyes, was never meant to have this position. The flashes of cameras exploded in rapid succession, illuminating the scene like a battlefield. Lenses pointed straight at the sleek black luxury car as it pulled up to the courthouse steps. The clicking of shutters, the hum of microphones, the hurried footsteps. Together, they created a chaotic symphony of judgment. They were all waiting for Naomi Carter to break. The car door opened. From the shadows, a figure stepped out. Dr. Naomi Carter. She did not flinch. Her smooth, dark skin stood in stark contrast against the cold flashes of the cameras, each one desperate to dissect every detail of her face. A black woman, stepping out into a crowd that was eager to prove she didn't belong. With every step onto the frozen pavement, the air around her seemed to still for a fleeting moment. A lone woman standing against the world. Her deep navy blue suit hugged her tall frame with flawless precision. Not a single crease, not a hint of hesitation. Her dark hair was neatly pulled back, each strand arranged with the same discipline that ruled her life, never allowing time nor prejudice to make her careless. But her eyes were cold, not because she was afraid, not because she was guilty, but because she had seen this all before. The scrutiny, the baseless accusations, the people who wanted nothing more than to watch her fall. Because she was a black woman in a world that had never truly accepted her. The microphones pushed closer, the voices of reporters overlapping, urgent, insistent, clawing at every second they could trap her. Do you have anything to say about these allegations? Why has all trace of your existence been erased? Are you hiding something? But Naomi did not answer. She did not need to explain herself. She simply walked, slow but unwavering, up the courthouse steps, through the roaring crowd. The noise around her swelled, but in her mind there was only silence. They wanted to see her afraid. They wanted to see her tremble. They wanted to see her collapse right here in front of these doors. Because if she failed, they would say it was inevitable. But Naomi Carter had never fallen. She stepped through the doors, leaving the storm behind. Inside the courtroom, the tension was so thick, it felt like a weight pressing down on everyone present. The high ceiling loomed above, adorned with crystal chandeliers casting a dim golden glow onto the cold marble floor. Dark wooden benches were lined up in perfect order, the jurors sitting upright, their eyes fixed on the center of the courtroom. The scratching of pens against paper from the reporters, the quiet rustling of case files from the attorneys, and the anxious breaths of the spectators all blended together into an undercurrent of pressure. At that moment, Prosecutor Richard Vaughn slowly rose to his feet. His gray suit was immaculate, not a single wrinkle in sight. His tie was neatly tightened. Adjusting the thin frames of his glasses, his sharp gaze swept across the courtroom before he stepped onto the polished wooden floor. Each of Vaughn's footsteps echoed with deliberate clarity, sinking the room into an even heavier silence. Reaching the center, Vaughn lifted his chin slightly, turning his face toward the judge, though his eyes never stopped scanning the jury. Reading every flicker of doubt, every subtle expression he could exploit. After a measured pause, Vaughn spoke, a deep, steady voice that carried the weight of authority. Your Honor, he deliberately stretched out the words, his gaze briefly cutting to Naomi Carter before returning to the judge. The defendant, Naomi Carter, has falsified her identity for over a decade. The statement landed with force, as if the verdict had already been decided. A ripple of reaction spread through the courtroom. A few jurors exchanged glances. An older woman frowned, while a younger man blinked rapidly, as if struggling to process what he had just heard. Among the press, someone hastily typed, the clacking of keys accelerating. A camera slowly panned, capturing every second of the moment. But Vaughn wasn't finished. He turned, moving with deliberate steps, as though choreographing a performance for the jury. Stopping at the prosecution's large wooden table, he set down a thick file with a sharp thud, the sound cutting through the room. His voice, now even more precise, followed. No degrees. The words landed like a blade slicing through the courtroom. No employment records. He raised an eyebrow, pushing the file slightly forward so the jury could clearly see the bold red classified stamp across the cover. No verifiable past. The air in the courtroom seemed to constrict. Vaughn glanced at the jury, calculating. He leaned forward slightly, both hands planted firmly on the table, his posture designed to drive his next words deeper. We conducted an investigation. There is no trace of Naomi Carter before the last 10 years. Silence swallowed the room. A few spectators whispered among themselves. An older juror furrowed his brows, tilting his head slightly as though trying to grasp the impossible. A person with no record of existence before 10 years ago? No proof that she had ever lived before that time? How could that be? No more murmurs. No more rustling of papers or the tapping of pens against the desk. The vast courtroom felt as if it had been swallowed by an oppressive silence, broken only by the faint ticking of the wall clock and the slow, measured breaths of those watching the trial unfold. In the jury box, a middle-aged man with graying hair adjusted his glasses on the bridge of his nose and leaned back against his chair. He folded his arms across his chest, his gaze fixed on Naomi Carter. Not with curiosity, not quite with disdain, but with doubt, laced with something just shy of mockery. A slight shake of his head, as if he had just heard something so absurd it was almost amusing. And then, in that moment, when the silence stretched so long it felt like it could be cut into pieces, he muttered under his breath, low but loud enough for those nearby to catch every single word. A black woman in a position this high? Suspicious. No one reacted immediately. A middle-aged woman in a light gray blazer glanced at him, her brows knitting slightly, as if she recognized that the comment shouldn't have been said, but saw no need to correct him. A younger juror, perhaps in his early 30s, flicked his eyes up briefly, the corner of his mouth tilting just slightly, as though the remark was hardly surprising. No one spoke up. No one told him he was wrong. No one turned to Naomi in discomfort or opposition to what had just been said. No one reminded him that this was not how a courtroom was supposed to function. The words lingered in the air, spreading slowly like ink bleeding across white paper. A small sentence, yet thick with meaning. A thought that perhaps many in this room shared but hadn't spoken aloud. A suspicion, an instinctive rejection of the idea that a black woman could have achieved what Naomi Carter had without deception. Naomi heard it. She didn't turn. She didn't shift in her seat. She didn't let a single flicker of emotion cross her face. She simply sat there, silent, her eyes unmoving on the wooden table before her, as if the words had never been spoken, as if they didn't exist. But deep within them, something flickered. Not anger, not pain, just exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who had heard these words too many times before. This wasn't the first time, and she knew. It wouldn't be the last. Beyond the courtroom, through the large glass windows, the flashes of dozens of cameras continued to flicker, relentlessly, as if the entire world outside was waiting for the moment Naomi Carter would finally break. Naomi stays silent, but what's going through her mind? Does she have a secret card to turn the tables? Prosecutor Vaughn stepped forward, his sharp gaze sweeping across the entire courtroom before settling on Naomi Carter's face. Not hurried, not rushed. He opened the thick file in his hands, turning each page slowly. The faint rustling of paper echoed through the utterly silent room, as if even that sound was adding weight to what was about to be revealed. The entire courtroom held its breath as Vaughn inhaled deliberately, and then, in his steady, commanding voice, he began to read the words on the pages before him, the evidence he believed would completely shatter Naomi Carter's image. There is no record of Naomi Carter ever graduating from any of the universities she claims to have attended. He lifted his head, his eyes scanning the jury, reading every subtle reaction. An older woman frowned slightly, a younger man raised an eyebrow in skepticism, while another juror simply sat upright, his gaze locked on the defendant. Vaughn let the silence linger for a moment, allowing his words to sink into the minds of everyone in the room before he continued. There is no trace of her ever having worked for the government. He lifted another stack of documents, raising it just high enough for the jury to see, before placing it on the table with a firm thud, a sharp, deliberate sound, as if each page inside carried an undeniable truth. No payroll records, no verifiable source of income for years that can confirm her background. Vaughn's words rang out, clear and measured, each syllable striking like a hammer against the foundation of the story Naomi Carter had built for so long. A murmur rippled through the spectators. A few reporters quickly jotted down notes, while others adjusted their cameras, capturing every reaction in the room. In the midst of it all, Vaughn stood tall, both hands planted firmly on the table, a faint smirk playing at the corner of his lips. The look of a man who believed he had the upper hand. The entire room was thick with the weight of doubt, the jury's eyes gradually shifting toward Naomi, waiting for an explanation, but she remained silent, unwavering. The air inside the courtroom grew thick as a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair stepped up to the witness stand. He adjusted his metal-framed glasses, placed a stack of documents in front of him, then took a deep breath before lifting his head to face the jury. Prosecutor Vaughn stood beside him, hands clasped behind his back, his piercing gaze locked onto Naomi Carter, before giving the witness a slight nod to begin. The man's voice rang out, firm and unwavering, as if every word he spoke had been verified 100 times over. We conducted an extensive investigation into Naomi Carter's academic records at every prestigious university she has claimed to have attended. After directly contacting student administration offices and meticulously reviewing archived records, we found only one clear conclusion. There is no record of any Naomi Carter ever enrolling in or graduating from these institutions. No degrees, no admissions records, no evidence that she ever set foot on those campuses. A heavy silence blanketed the courtroom. Some jurors exchanged brief glances, a few leaned forward slightly, straining to listen more closely, searching for a rational explanation for this glaring inconsistency. From the press section, fingers tapped furiously on keyboards, and camera lenses zoomed in on Naomi, waiting for her reaction. But she remained motionless, her expression unchanged, as if every accusation was nothing more than a passing breeze. Vaughn didn't allow the silence to linger for too long. He stepped forward and nodded toward another man approaching the stand, one who carried an air of professionalism, but whose eyes held a trace of unease. A former colleague of Naomi's, someone who had worked with her briefly before she seemingly vanished from everyone's radar. He adjusted his collar, cleared his throat, and then spoke, each word cutting through the already suffocating tension in the room. I don't know who she really is. Naomi Carter was at our office for a short period, not exactly unfriendly, but not entirely open either. She was meticulous in her work, but there was something off about her. She wasn't like the other employees. She asked strange questions, things no one in the office had ever thought to ask. She had no past, no personal anecdotes, no small talk that people usually share when getting to know their coworkers. And then, before I could ever figure out who she really was, she disappeared. The air in the courtroom felt sucked dry. One juror furrowed his brow, suspicion flickering in his eyes. A reporter near the back leaned toward a colleague, whispering under his breath, no degrees, no records, no coworkers who really knew who she was. This is starting to sound like a spy story. But Vaughn didn't leave room for speculation. He was the one to drive the final point home. He turned, walking deliberately toward the jury, his expression calm yet utterly self-assured, as if the case had already been decided in this very moment. Taking a measured breath, his deep, commanding voice rang out, clear and decisive against the thick atmosphere of doubt. All the evidence leads to one undeniable conclusion. Naomi Carter fabricated an entire life to deceive the system. A person with no degrees, no past, no records in any institution, yet somehow she climbed to this position. There is only one reasonable explanation. She has been lying from the very beginning. The words dropped like a gavel, shaking the foundation of the trial, sending ripples through the jury and everyone present. No one in the room could take their eyes off Naomi. No one could suppress the burning curiosity. Who exactly was Naomi Carter? And if everything about her was merely a veil over the truth, then what was really hiding beneath it? The courtroom remained heavy with tension in the aftermath of Prosecutor Vaughn's sharp declaration. Some members of the jury stayed silent, their eyes locked onto Naomi Carter, as if trying to see through her, searching for any sign that might confirm whether the accusations against her were true. But not everyone stayed silent. A white man, likely in his early 50s, sat with his arms crossed over his chest, leaning back in his chair, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. His expression wasn't quite anger, nor disappointment. It was open mockery, as if what he had just heard was too ridiculous to take seriously. He shook his head slightly before speaking, his voice not particularly loud, but clear enough for those around him to hear. A single sentence that seemed to freeze the air in the courtroom for a few seconds. "I don't believe a black woman could have landed a job like that. It had to be fraud." The already tense atmosphere shattered under the weight of that bitter remark. Some jurors turned to glance at him. One furrowed his brows in mild discomfort. Another simply remained silent, as if the comment wasn't out of place at all. An older female juror nearby shifted slightly forward in her seat, her hands clasped together, a flicker of unease crossing her face. But she said nothing. No one objected. A silent force settled over the room, so dense it could almost be felt. Naomi sat still at the defendant's table, her face betraying no emotion. She didn't turn to look at the juror who had spoken, nor did she react with anger or shock at his derision. But in her eyes, buried beneath the mask of composure, something flickered. Not pain, not rage, but exhaustion. Not because the words hurt, but because she had heard them too many times before. Outside the courtroom, the media wasted no time seizing the storm. Sensational headlines began flooding news outlets, each one like a spark thrown onto dry grass, turning the trial from a legal battle into an uncontrollable media wildfire. Naomi Carter, con artist or mysterious genius, blazed across the front page of a major newspaper, accompanied by a striking image. Naomi walking into the courthouse, her expression calm, her eyes sharp, while behind her, a swarm of reporters shoved microphones toward her, mouths open mid-question, desperate for a statement. A news channel went live, with an anchor speaking in an animated voice. "The biggest question right now is Naomi Carter a mastermind who deceived an entire nation, or just a fraud with an impossibly perfect cover story?" Across the country, debate erupted. The public split into two camps, one side believing Naomi Carter was a victim of a biased system, the other convinced she was the greatest con artist of the era. Naomi remained silent. In that moment, it felt as though the entire courtroom was waiting, watching her, anticipating a reaction, a defense, or even the slightest flicker of emotion. But Naomi Carter, with her steady gaze and hands loosely clasped on the table, remained still, unfazed, as if none of the accusations had managed to touch her. A veil of composure surrounded her, leaving everyone wondering, what is she hiding? But now Naomi's silence only amplified the voice that rose beside her. Judith Reinhardt, her defense attorney, stood up. She was a petite but formidable woman, her sharp eyes glinting behind thin black-rimmed glasses. As she stepped forward, her gaze swept across the room, unwavering. She paused just long enough to let the weight of the moment settle before taking a deep breath and speaking. "Your Honor," her voice was firm, deliberate, each word falling like steady drops of water on parched earth, dampening the fire that had just been ignited. "The absence of records does not mean deception." She let the words linger, her sharp gaze locking onto Prosecutor Vaughn before shifting toward the jury. "We all know that, in this world, there are truths that remain hidden for reasons of national security. It is entirely possible," Judith emphasized, her tone steady and grave, "that Naomi Carter's records were erased not because of fraud, but because what she has done was in service of this country." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Some jurors exchanged glances. Others sat up straighter, as if suddenly roused from a long-held assumption. From the spectator section, whispers grew louder. Reporters scrambled to jot down notes, cameras panned across the room, capturing every shift in expression, every flicker of doubt. And then the real question settled in. If Naomi was truly a government operative, Why had no one come forward to defend her? The suspicion that had once been aimed at her now twisted into something else, something deeper, more unsettling. If she had served this nation, why was the government staying silent? Once again, all eyes turned to Naomi, but this time there was no longer just judgment or ridicule in their gazes. Now there was curiosity, maybe even a hint of unease. Could the woman sitting before them truly be guarding secrets far beyond what they could imagine? Judith returned to her seat, giving Naomi a brief nod, an unspoken message of unwavering trust. But Naomi remained motionless, her eyes distant, as though staring past the walls of the courtroom, beyond the people watching her, towards something only she could see. Was it real, or was it a lie? What truth lay hidden behind that calm facade? The courtroom seemed suspended in a mist of uncertainty, hovering on the edge of revelation. A turning point was approaching, and no one could predict what would come next. The sky had darkened by the time Naomi Carter stepped out of the courthouse, leaving behind a media storm still raging in full force. The flashes of cameras continued to flicker. Reporters' voices still hurled questions at her, relentless and demanding. But she ignored them all. In the midst of hundreds of eyes tracking her every move, she simply walked, slow, steady, controlled. Or at least, appearing to be in control. The truth was, she controlled nothing. A sleek black car idled at the curb, its back door swinging open just as she approached. Naomi slid inside, the door shutting behind her with a decisive thud, severing the chaos outside. Judith Reinhardt, her attorney, was already seated in the front, her face illuminated by the faint glow of the passing streetlights. She said nothing. The driver, an unfamiliar man, remained silent as well. Naomi didn't need to ask. She already knew this car wasn't arranged by the law firm. No one spoke. The silence inside the cabin stretched as the car pulled away from the courthouse, weaving through the bustling streets of Washington, D.C. It wasn't the tight space that made the air feel heavy. It was the knowledge that this was only the beginning. The sudden vibration of her phone startled her. Naomi reached into her coat pocket. No name, no number. Just two words, stark and chilling. Unknown caller. Her finger hovered over the screen for a fraction of a second. Her pulse quickened, just slightly. There were only a handful of people, them, who could be calling her at this moment. Judith cast a quick glance in her direction, a flicker of caution in her eyes. Naomi didn't speak. She tightened her grip on the phone, then swiped to answer. A deep male voice came through immediately, leaving no room for hesitation. "Don't say anything. Let us handle it." 4 words, but they sliced through her mind like a cold, sharp blade. No greeting, no identification, just a command. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, gripping the phone tighter. She didn't need to ask. She didn't need to guess. She knew exactly who was on the other end of the line. A chill ran down her spine. A strange feeling crept into her. Not fear, not relief, but an unsettling kind of dread. She didn't respond. She knew the rules. No questions, no confirmations, no reactions, just silence. The quiet breathing on the other end lingered for a few more seconds, as if the caller was assessing her. Then, click. The call ended. The screen went dark, leaving only the warmth of the phone in her hand. But in Naomi's mind, questions ignited like electrical sparks in a pitch-black room. They knew. They had been watching the trial. They had known everything from the start. But why hadn't they stepped in? Naomi clenched her fist, nails digging into her palm hard enough to sting. If the CIA was truly behind her, if what she had done was as important as she believed, then why were they treating her like a liability rather than someone worth protecting? Why were they letting her stand alone against a system that wanted to crush her? Outside the car window, the streetlights blurred past, casting flickering reflections on Naomi's unreadable face. She was no longer just a woman on trial. She had become a pawn on a chessboard controlled by forces far greater than her. The air in the courtroom thickened once more, as if even the dust particles were holding their breath in anticipation. Every gaze was fixed on the heavy wooden doors at the back of the room, where an unexpected figure was about to enter. Everyone present knew that this case had drawn overwhelming attention, But no one had foreseen that a high-ranking CIA official would personally step into this courtroom. The doors slowly creaked open. The hinges groaned, a small, almost insignificant sound, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 pounds. Standing in the doorway was a man of commanding presence, his black suit tailored to perfection, not a single crease out of place. His polished leather shoes struck the wooden floor with an air of certainty and absolute authority. Mark Delaney. No introduction was needed, no announcement was necessary. Those familiar with the shadowed corridors of government power recognized his name instantly. A high-ranking CIA official, a man who only surfaced when something needed to be handled behind closed doors. Not a public figure, not someone the media could easily reach. His presence in this courtroom at this very moment carried implications too significant to ignore. At the prosecution's table, Richard Vaughn tensed. He remained still, but his hands, resting on the table, clenched tightly. His thumb tapped unconsciously against the edge of the document in front of him. His gaze darkened, sharp and calculating. Vaughn didn't need anyone to spell it out. He knew immediately that Delaney's presence could unravel everything he had so meticulously built. No one spoke. Delaney didn't glance around. He paid no attention to the dozens of eyes glued to him. He walked forward with measured precision, his movements exuding gravity, his every step echoing through the silent room. Directly approaching the judge's bench, he stopped, carefully retrieving a thick dossier from his briefcase. The matte black cover bore a red-sealed imprint at the top. Classified, authorized personnel only. Without hesitation, he placed it before Judge Foster. No one in the room exhaled with ease. The jury, the spectators, everyone was on edge. Some instinctively leaned forward as if trying to get a closer look at the file now resting on the judge's desk. In the press section, reporters exchanged glances, some furiously jotting down notes, while others snapped photos, desperate to capture this moment. Judge Foster, a seasoned man with a severe expression, stared at the classified dossier but didn't rush to open it. He knew exactly what such a document entailed. Anything bearing the CIA's seal was never just evidence. It always carried far greater risks, repercussions that extended far beyond the walls of this courtroom. The judge lifted his gaze, his voice low but firm enough to resonate through the room. "Mr. Mark Delaney, in what capacity are you here today?" Delaney didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and retrieved a small identification badge. He didn't raise it high. He didn't flaunt it. He simply placed it on the desk in front of the judge. Some jurors raised their eyebrows. A few of them seemed to realize, perhaps for the first time, that they weren't merely deliberating over a fraud case. They had unknowingly stumbled into something much larger. After a brief but heavy pause, Delaney finally spoke. "I am here as a representative of the Central Intelligence Agency." The words fell like a bomb, shaking the very foundation of the courtroom. The jury exchanged looks, some whispering, while others sat frozen, their expressions rigid with the weight of realization. At the prosecution's table, Vaughn couldn't hide his frustration. He slowly straightened, fingers interlacing as his jaw tightened. He didn't like this, because if the CIA had stepped in, it meant this case was no longer a simple game he could manipulate. At the defense table, Naomi Carter remained motionless, her eyes locked onto Mark Delaney. No surprise, no hesitation. She had known this moment would come. She had always known they wouldn't let her fall completely. But the only question circling in her mind wasn't if they would help her, but how far they were willing to go, and at what cost. The entire courtroom felt suspended in an invisible limbo. No one knew what would happen next, but everyone understood one thing. The game had changed. The matte black dossier remained in front of him, thick and heavy, as if it carried the weight of an enormous secret. The bold red lettering on the cover seemed to burn under the harsh courtroom lights. Classified, authorized personnel only. Every eye in the room was fixed on him. No one dared to breathe too loudly. Each person was drawn into the tension of the moment, waiting for something to be revealed. Something that could change the very nature of this case. The judge placed a hand on the file. His fingers trembled slightly as they traced the edge of the cover. He paused for a brief moment, as if bracing himself for what was about to come. In nearly 3 decades on the federal bench, He had handled high-profile cases, had seen shocking evidence presented before him, but never before had he opened a dossier bearing the direct seal of the Central Intelligence Agency. He swallowed dryly. Taking a slow, measured breath, the judge reached for the upper corner of the file and pulled. The tearing of the security seal ripped through the silence like a gunshot. And then he began to read. It only took a few seconds. At first, his eyes skimmed the first page, his brows furrowing slightly as he processed the information in front of him. A second later, the lines on his forehead deepened, his breathing slowed. But by the time he flipped to the second page, the change in his expression was undeniable. The color drained from his face, from calm to confusion to something close to shock, all in an instant. The wrinkles on his forehead deepened, his grip on the file tightened, his knuckles turning white, his lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. And for a fleeting moment, this man, a man who had spent his life in the judiciary, who had faced some of the most dangerous and complex cases in the country, sat utterly frozen, as if he had just seen something that should not exist. At the prosecution's table, Richard Vaughn stiffened. He remained still, but his eyes darkened, his posture sharpening like a predator sensing danger. He scrutinized every flicker of movement on the judge's face, every furrow of his brows, every sign of hesitation, and he didn't like what he saw. He had seen judges open evidence files before, but never had he seen one go pale, stunned, and seemingly at war with his own perception of reality. In the jury box, a few members began exchanging uneasy glances. An older woman frowned, craning her neck as if she could somehow see inside the file. A younger juror unconsciously shifted in his seat, his grip tightening on the edge of his chair, as though he needed something solid to hold on to. From the press section, the atmosphere was just as chaotic. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, some whispering frantically to one another, trying to make sense of what was happening. A cameraman nudged his colleague, signaling for a better angle. Focus on the judge. Capture every shift in his face. And at the defense table, Naomi Carter did not blink. She showed no emotion, no reaction, but the way her fingers lightly tapped against the surface of the table, the way her breathing remained slow and even, it was clear she was not surprised, because she already knew exactly what was inside that file. The real question was, now the judge knew too. For that brief, suffocating moment, the courtroom felt as if it had plunged into a void, where the earlier accusations, the so-called damning evidence laid out by Vaughn, the confidence of the prosecution, suddenly seemed small, insignificant, because whatever had just been unveiled had the power to change everything. Why did the judge go pale? What did he just discover that could change the entire case? The fight for justice is just beginning. More shocking twists are ahead. Don't miss a moment. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay with us. Thank you for standing for truth and justice. Where are you watching from? Let us know. Judge Foster remained motionless, his eyes locked onto the file before him, but it was clear to everyone in the room that his hands were gripping the edges so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The entire courtroom had been swallowed by a suffocating silence, where even the air itself felt heavy under the weight of the truth that had just been unveiled. Slowly, with a tension-ridden expression, as if he was forcing himself to accept what he had just read, the judge lifted his gaze, scanning the room. He looked at the jury, ordinary citizens tasked with the simple duty of determining guilt or innocence, now entangled in a secret far beyond their comprehension. He looked at prosecutor Richard Vaughn, who sat frozen, lips pressed so tightly together they had lost their color, as if he too realized that this case had spun entirely out of his control. And finally, he looked at Naomi Carter. Naomi remained still, her face betraying no shock. She had always known this moment would come. It was only a matter of when. But what she cared about more was, why now? The judge took a deep breath, as if steadying himself before speaking. His voice dropped, no longer carrying the same authority as before, replaced instead by pure, deliberate caution. According to the documents submitted by the Central Intelligence Agency, he paused, flipping to another page, double-checking the content as if even he couldn't believe what he was about to announce to the entire courtroom. The defendant, Naomi Carter, was a high-level intelligence operative working under a false identity. A shock-wave ripped through the room. The jury sat stunned, some with their mouths slightly open but unable to form words, others simply frozen in place, realizing that everything they thought they knew about this case was now a lie. One juror, who had previously mocked Naomi in an earlier session, instinctively leaned back in his seat, his expression suddenly cautious. At the prosecution table, Vaughn sat rigid as stone. He had poured his entire career into this case, had gone on record publicly declaring Naomi a fraud, had confidently presented his argument that she had fabricated her life to manipulate the system. And now, right before his eyes, the United States government had confirmed he was wrong. From the press section, chaos erupted. Reporters typed furiously, pages flipped wildly in notebooks, phones lifted in the air to capture the moment. A female journalist whispered to her colleague, her voice trembling with excitement, "This isn't just a trial anymore. This is an intelligence scandal unfolding in real time." But none of it compared to Naomi Carter. She remained seated, her eyes dark, hands clasped together on the table. No reaction, no surprise, no flicker of doubt. Judge Foster swallowed hard, his eyes glued to the text in the file as if needing to read it one more time to be certain he wasn't hallucinating. But the truth remained, printed in stark black ink, impossible to ignore. Lifting another page, his voice dropped further, but the weight of his words filled the room. Her records were erased due to matters of national security. The courtroom shattered. Some people sat in stunned silence, unable to speak. Others turned urgently to whisper amongst themselves. Several jurors blinked rapidly, their minds scrambling to process this seismic shift in the case. A younger juror leaned forward, pressing a hand to his forehead, his face stunned. No records, no evidence of her past. Not because Naomi Carter was a fraud, but because the government had erased her. No one in the courtroom could continue to believe this was just a case of simple identity fraud. Because when the CIA intervened, when files disappeared by government order, the real question was no longer whether Naomi had lied. The real question was, what had she done to be wiped from history? At the prosecution table, Richard Vaughn blinked rapidly, his breathing uneven. He didn't want to believe this. He couldn't believe this. His entire career, everything he had staked on this case, was it all crumbling in real time? At the defense table, Judith Reinhardt slowly turned toward Naomi. She didn't ask. She didn't have to, but her eyes carried an unspoken understanding. Naomi knew. She had known from the moment the trial began that the CIA would step in, that her secrets could never stay buried forever. Richard Vaughn could not let it end like this. He sat motionless for a few seconds after the judge read aloud the contents of the file. But inside, his mind was working at a furious pace. He had spent months building this case, exposing Naomi Carter to the public, proving that she was nothing more than a professional fraud. And now the CIA had shown up with a single file and unraveled everything? No, there was no way he would allow that to happen. He took a deep breath, adjusted his posture, and then suddenly stood up. "Your Honor," Vaughn's voice rang out, sharper than ever, carrying no trace of surrender. "If she truly was a CIA operative, I have a very simple question." He turned toward the judge, then swept his gaze across the courtroom, locking eyes with every juror, every reporter seated in the gallery. Why did they let her defend herself? His words landed like a slap in the middle of the already tense room. A juror shifted slightly in their seat, brows knitting together. Others exchanged brief glances, saying nothing, but uncertainty was now etched on their faces. Vaughn saw it. He knew he still had a chance. He pressed forward, his voice growing stronger, more commanding. A high-ranking intelligence operative, someone the government deems important enough to erase from every official record. Someone who, if this file is telling the truth, has been involved in top-secret operations. He paused for a second, then leaned forward, his voice dropping, slow and deliberate. Then why, when faced with the threat of conviction, did they not send legal representation to defend her? The jury murmured amongst themselves again. A few whispered, others tapped their fingers on the wooden table, as if they had just realized something wasn't adding up. Vaughn glanced at Naomi Carter. She remained silent. She did not object. She did not interrupt. She did not show any signs that he was wrong, and that silence only deepened the jury's doubts. Maybe she's not really an operative. Maybe she was an operative, but the CIA cut her loose. Or maybe she used her position to do something wrong, and that's why they aren't protecting her. A juror, a middle-aged man with a calculating gaze, suddenly spoke, shattering the tense silence. If the CIA truly cared about her, they wouldn't have left her to face this alone. His words were like gasoline poured over an already blazing fire of doubt. Another juror nodded. An older woman pursed her lips, her expression heavy with thought. The narrative of Naomi Carter as an innocent agent, wrongfully prosecuted, was beginning to crack. Vaughn saw it, and he seized the moment immediately. He stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with the sharpness of a predator sensing its prey's weakness. We cannot blindly trust a file. We cannot simply take the CIA's word that she was an agent and erase all suspicion. He stopped just in front of the jury, planting both hands firmly on the table, leaning in. His voice was steady, weighted with conviction. Because if we accept that without asking further questions, then who's to say Naomi Carter didn't use her position for something far worse? Now the jury was no longer silent. They were fully caught in the storm of doubt Vaughn had unleashed. Vaughn made a crucial point. A high-ranking intelligence officer wouldn't be left to fend for herself. Could it be that Naomi is no longer someone the CIA trusts? The tension in the courtroom remained suffocating in the wake of the CIA's revelations. The claim that Naomi Carter had once been a high-level intelligence operative still echoed in the minds of everyone present. But Richard Vaughn refused to back down. He knew that if he stopped now, the case would be over, and Naomi Carter would walk out of here without a scratch. He could not let that happen. Vaughn straightened his posture, his sharp gaze sweeping across the room before a cold smile curled at the corner of his lips, like a predator that had just found its prey's weakness. He had one final move left to play. "Your Honor," Vaughn's voice rang out, crisp and deliberate. He enunciated every word carefully, ensuring that what he was about to say would embed itself into the minds of the jury. "I would like to present new testimony, a testimony from someone whose credibility cannot be questioned." He lifted a hand in signal, and the doors of the courtroom slowly swung open. Mark Latham entered. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as the man stepped inside. A former CIA operative. A man who had once worked on classified operations. A man who had belonged to the same world Naomi Carter had operated in. Latham did not rush forward. He carried himself with a firm, composed demeanor, his graying hair neatly cropped, his dark suit crisp and precise. But what drew the most attention were his eyes. Sharp, quiet, holding a distinct air of wariness. He moved forward with slow, deliberate steps toward the witness stand, where Vaughn was already waiting. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier, more suffocating than ever. Naomi Carter remained still in her seat, but her fingers had stopped tapping against the table. Not out of fear, but because she knew Mark Latham, and if he was here, it meant that someone had orchestrated this well in advance. Latham stepped up to the stand, placing his hand on the Bible to take the oath. Vaughn wasted no time. He turned to face him, eyes gleaming with a predator's triumph. "Mr. Latham," Vaughn began, his voice calculated and steady, "you were a CIA operative, correct?" "Yes." Latham's voice was low, firm. "And you worked with the defendant, Naomi Carter?" Latham glanced briefly at Naomi before answering. His expression held no hostility, but it also carried no sympathy. "Yes." A ripple of murmurs swept through the courtroom, but Vaughn wasn't finished. He raised an eyebrow, deliberately drawing out the moment so the jury could fully absorb the gravity of what was about to unfold. Then he stepped in closer, his tone dropping, calculated, provocative. "Can you tell the court what Naomi Carter did during her time with the CIA?" Latham leaned slightly forward, his hands clasped together on the stand. He didn't answer immediately, but when he spoke, his words cut through the air like a blade. "Naomi Carter manipulated intelligence for personal gain." The courtroom erupted. The jury was stunned. Reporters frantically took notes, some hammering away at their keyboards, sending immediate updates. At the prosecution's table, Vaughn allowed himself the faintest smirk. He had just landed a decisive blow. Everything the CIA had just presented in Naomi's defense, it had all just crumbled in a single statement. Because if a former CIA operative, a man who had worked alongside her, was willing to testify that she had abused her position, exploited her power, then who would still believe she was innocent? All eyes turned to Naomi. The air in the courtroom was thick, like the calm before a storm. Whispered conversations rippled through the jury box, the press section, and the attorneys' tables. Urgent, frantic exchanges. Mark Latham's accusation had landed like a blade, slicing through everything the defense had built. But this fight was not over. The courtroom doors swung open again. Mark Delaney stepped in. This time he was not just a high-ranking CIA official. Gone was the detached observer from before. This time he entered holding something that could change the entire game. In his hand was a small black recording device, a seemingly insignificant object, yet one that carried the weight to obliterate every accusation against Naomi Carter. He walked toward the witness stand with steady, measured steps, his eyes briefly flicking toward Vaughn before settling on Mark Latham, who still sat on the stand, his expression unreadable. "Your Honor," Delaney's voice was calm but razor-sharp, carrying the authority of a man accustomed to life-or-death negotiations. "I have new evidence, a recording, one that will reveal the truth about Naomi Carter." The courtroom exploded again. Reporters scrambled to adjust their recorders, some already firing off rapid tweets with breaking updates. A female juror raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by what was about to happen. Judge Foster's brow furrowed. He despised the chaos unfolding before him, but he knew he couldn't ignore what had just been introduced. "Mr. Delaney," the judge said, voice heavy with caution, "please clarify the nature of this evidence." Delaney gave a single nod and placed the recorder on the evidence table. His hands were steady. "This is a recording of a conversation between Naomi Carter and Mark Latham during an operation they were both involved in. If the court permits, I will play it now." The judge's gaze shifted to Vaughn, then to Naomi. After a beat of consideration, he gave a single nod. Delaney pressed play. A faint static crackled through the speakers. Then came Naomi Carter's voice. "You're asking me to do this? To manipulate a report? To turn an innocent target into a traitor?" A pause, then another voice, Mark Latham. "These are orders from above, Carter. We don't have a choice." A chair creaked as if someone had suddenly stood. "No!" Naomi's voice was sharp, cutting through the silence. "I won't do this. If you want to deceive your own government, do it yourself." A loud sound, a hand slamming onto a table. "Don't you get it?" Latham's voice grew tense. "If you don't do this, they'll find someone who will. And the next person might not say no like you just did." Naomi let out a cold, quiet laugh. "Then let them. I won't dirty my hands." The recording ended. For a moment, absolute silence. And then, the courtroom exploded. The jury stirred, murmurs growing into a full-blown commotion. The press section descended into chaos. Reporters lunged forward, cameras flashing as they rushed to capture the reactions unfolding before them. At the prosecution table, Richard Vaughn turned pale. He blinked rapidly, as if struggling to process what he had just heard. He had been played. Naomi Carter had not been the manipulator. Mark Latham had been the one manipulating the truth. The jury exchanged glances, but this time, they had their answer. Vaughn lost control. He shot up from his seat, rounding on Latham, his voice a near snarl. "What the hell is this? You told me Carter was a fraud." Latham said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Every accusation Vaughn had painstakingly constructed, every argument he had built to paint Naomi as the villain, all of it had crumbled. Mark Delaney turned, his gaze settling on Naomi Carter. This time he wasn't the one presenting evidence, nor the man withholding the truth. He simply nodded, a small, measured nod. Naomi Carter had won. A thick silence hung over the courtroom. The tension was suffocating, pressing down on everyone like an unseen force. The weight of everything that had unfolded, the accusations, the betrayals, the shocking revelations, now rested on one man's shoulders. Judge Foster sat behind his imposing bench, hands folded tightly in front of him, his expression unreadable. He had spent decades in this very position, rendering verdicts that decided the fates of men and women, but this case was unlike any other. His gaze flicked toward the prosecution's table, where Richard Vaughn sat stiffly, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles along his face twitched. He hadn't moved since the final piece of evidence had been revealed, since the truth had shattered the foundation of his case. Judge Foster exhaled, lifting his gavel slightly before lowering it back down to the desk, his fingers tightening around the polished wood. When he spoke, his voice was steady, yet heavy with the weight of what was about to be declared. After careful consideration of the evidence presented in this trial, and in light of new, indisputable proof, he paused. No one in the courtroom moved. No one dared breathe. This court finds the defendant, Naomi Carter. Another pause, a second that stretched into eternity. Not guilty. The words fell like a thunderclap, shaking the very foundation of the room. All charges against Naomi Carter are hereby dismissed. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The kind of silence that comes not from peace, but from sheer disbelief. Then the room erupted, gasps, whispers, the frantic clicking of reporters' keyboards as they scrambled to file their breaking headlines. The shuffle of bodies as members of the audience turned to one another, some in relief, others in shock, a few still too stunned to react at all. At the defense table, Naomi Carter remained still, unmoving, unflinching. She had prepared herself for every possible outcome. She had trained herself to endure whatever was thrown her way. But even now, with her name officially cleared, she refused to show any sign of weakness. Only her eyes flickered, just for a moment. A brief shimmer of something deep, unreadable. Was it relief? Was it vindication? Or was it something else entirely? Across the room, Richard Vaughn sat frozen, his fingers gripping the edges of his table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Everything he had built, everything he had worked for, was gone. His case had unraveled before his eyes, his credibility shattered. The man who had once been the golden prosecutor, the face of unwavering justice, had now been exposed as someone who had pursued the wrong enemy. His greatest case had become his greatest failure, and the world was watching. Somewhere in the back of the courtroom, a journalist whispered into her recorder, voice barely audible over the commotion, "Richard Vaughn has just lost everything." The courtroom had long emptied, but Richard Vaughn remained seated, staring blankly at the polished wood of the defense table. His once pristine suit was now wrinkled, his tie loosened, his confidence drained. The echoes of the judge's ruling still rang in his ears, though the room was now silent. He had lost. Not just a case, not just a trial, but everything. The door swung open, the sharp sound of leather shoes clicking against the marble floor, cutting through the silence. Vaughn didn't need to look up to know who it was. District Attorney Charles Whitmore. He didn't sit, didn't offer condolences, didn't soften his expression. He simply stood there, arms crossed, his gaze cold and heavy. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke. "You embarrass this office." Vaughn swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. He had expected anger, had braced himself for disappointment, but the weight of Whitmore's words still landed like a hammer. "You built a case on arrogance, ignored warning signs, and dragged this department through a circus. You let personal ambition blind you, and in the end, you were played." The words cut deep, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. Vaughn opened his mouth, searching for something to say, some way to justify himself, to fight back. But Whitmore wasn't done. "The media is calling for your resignation." Vaughn's fingers curled into fists. He had seen the headlines. The fall of Richard Vaughn, how one man's obsession led to his own ruin. Vaughn's career in free fall after humiliating loss. From prosecutor to pariah. Where did Vaughn go wrong? They weren't just articles. They were obituaries. "Give me a few months," Vaughn finally muttered. "Let this blow over and I can—" "You're done." Whitmore's voice was sharp, final. Vaughn felt his stomach twist as the words settled over him, like a noose tightening around his throat. "You're being disbarred, Vaughn. The ethics committee is reviewing your conduct, and let's just say, they're not feeling generous. The evidence suppression, The way you railroaded Carter without cause. There's no coming back from that. Disbarred. The word alone was enough to make Vaughn feel physically ill. Whitmore leaned in slightly, lowering his voice, his tone almost pitying now. Take the resignation. It's the only dignity you have left. Vaughn swallowed the bitter taste rising in his throat. For years he had walked into courtrooms like a king, had commanded attention, respect, had crushed anyone who stood in his way. And now? Now he was nothing. His hands trembled as he reached for the resignation letter sitting neatly on the desk in front of him, the ink still fresh, waiting for his signature. His name, the same name that had once inspired fear and admiration, was now a curse, a cautionary tale. His fingers wrapped around the pen. He hesitated, his mind racing, his pride screaming at him to resist, to fight, to find a way out. But there was no way out. There was only this. He let out a slow, ragged breath. Then, with a heavy stroke, he signed. And just like that, Richard Vaughn was erased. The city stretched out before her, a vast expanse of glowing lights and shadowed streets, pulsing with life even as the night deepened. From the window of her apartment, Naomi Carter watched it all, her reflection faintly mirrored in the glass. Washington, D.C. was never truly still. Cars moved in rhythmic lines along the avenues below, and distant sirens wove through the hum of a city that never slept. But inside this room, in this moment, there was nothing but silence. She had won. The gavel had fallen. The judge had spoken. Her name had been cleared, her past vindicated, her future uncertain. The trial that had nearly erased her had instead restored her, albeit at a cost. The world now knew her name, though most would never understand the truth behind it. She was no longer a ghost, no longer the woman without a history. But as the headlines shifted to the next scandal, the next controversy, she knew that this moment, this fleeting quiet, would not last. A vibration against the wooden table shattered the stillness. Naomi's gaze flicked downward. Her phone. The screen pulsed once, illuminating the dark room. A single word flashed across it. Restricted. No number. No caller ID. She didn't need one. For a long moment, she just stared at it, fingers poised but unmoving. She had known this call would come. She had expected it from the moment she stepped out of that courtroom. Perhaps she had even been waiting for it. And yet, seeing it now, the reality of it settled heavily over her, pressing against her ribs like a weight she thought she had left behind. It rang again, once, twice. She let it go to the third, then picked up. She didn't speak. A familiar voice came through, steady, controlled, the kind of voice that carried authority without needing to raise in volume. Carter. No greeting, no hesitation. Just her name, spoken like a summons. She remained silent, her breath even, her grip firm around the phone, letting the quiet stretch between them, letting them feel the space she wasn't rushing to fill. It was a dance she knew well. In their world, words were measured, used only when necessary. After a beat, the voice on the other end continued. We have a mission for you. It wasn't a question. It never was. Naomi exhaled, her gaze drifting back to the window. The city looked different now, as if she were already slipping away from it, already seeing it through a different lens. A mission. Not an offer. Not a request. A mission. The past few months had been about survival, about fighting for her name, her freedom, her truth. She had clawed her way back from the edge, had exposed corruption, had proven that she was not the fraud they tried to paint her as. But now, this wasn't about proving anything. This was about who she was, and who she had always been. She had told herself that she wanted to be free of it, that once the trial was over, she would walk away, disappear into anonymity, build something for herself outside of the shadows. Maybe even try to live a normal life. But as she stood there, phone pressed to her ear, hearing those familiar words once more, she knew the truth. She was never meant for normal. There was no walking away. Not really. Her fingers tightened slightly around the phone, the only movement betraying the war happening inside her. She had a choice, perhaps for the first time in years, a real choice. But did it matter when she already knew the answer? She let another breath slip through her lips, slow and steady, before she finally spoke. "Send me the file." Her voice was calm, certain. On the other end, there was a pause, brief but unmistakable. Not hesitation, acknowledgement. Then the voice returned, just as composed. "Check your secure line." And then silence. The call had ended. Naomi lowered the phone slowly, staring at the darkened screen. She wasn't surprised. It was how it always worked. Brief, precise, no room for unnecessary words. Just enough to remind her that she had never truly been free, that her past wasn't something that could be erased with a courtroom verdict. She turned away from the window and crossed the room, her bare feet making no sound against the hardwood floor. The small safe in the corner sat untouched, just another unassuming part of the apartment. To anyone else it would seem ordinary, something used for storing personal documents, old records, valuables. But Naomi Carter didn't keep jewelry or financial statements locked away. She reached for the keypad and entered a sequence she hadn't used in months. The lock clicked open, revealing a sleek, black laptop inside. A secure, untraceable device, disconnected from conventional networks. The last link between her and the world she had once sworn to leave behind. She hesitated. Then, without another thought, she powered it on. The screen flickered to life. A single notification blinked in the corner. An encrypted message, waiting. She clicked it open. The file began to download. Her eyes scanned the opening lines, taking in the mission parameters. The location, the target. The details were familiar. Covert extraction, high risk, deep cover. Nothing she hadn't done before. And yet this time, something felt different. Because this time, she wasn't just stepping back into the world of espionage. This time, she was choosing to. A slow, knowing breath left her lips. Perhaps she had never truly left. Perhaps deep down, she had always been waiting for this. The mission briefing continued scrolling, details filling the screen. But Naomi was no longer reading. Her mind was already racing ahead, calculating possibilities, weighing risks. The old instincts, the ones she had buried beneath court documents and legal battles, were already sharpening, clicking into place like pieces of a puzzle she had long since mastered. This wasn't about redemption. This wasn't about proving she was innocent. This was about what came next. Naomi reached for the edge of the laptop, closed the screen, and stood. Outside, the city stretched endlessly before her, vast and unpredictable, full of people who would never know the things she had done, the choices she had made. Somewhere in the night, a plane was waiting. A new name, a new identity, a new mission. And Naomi Carter, the woman who was never meant to exist, was ready. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.